My name is Christina, and I'm 23 years old. I still remember that gut-wrenching moment I discovered my father's stepmother and stepsister left for a luxury Hawaiian vacation without me. My stepmother's cruel words still ring in my ears. "You're nothing but a freeloader living in our house like you own the place." Their laughter at my pain after years of unpaid labor in their home cut deeper than any knife. My father's betrayal nearly broke me, but instead, it became the catalyst that transformed me from doormat to homeowner, permanently changing our family dynamic. Before I share my story of reclaiming my power, let me know where you're watching from in the comments and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against family who took you for granted. I had a beautiful childhood until I was 12. My mother was my world. She was warm, supportive, and filled our home with love and laughter. We were a tight-knit family of three: my father James, my mother Elizabeth, and me. Mom was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer when I was 11. Despite aggressive treatment, she passed away just 14 months later. Her death devastated both my father and me. Dad and I had been extremely close before Mom died. He would take me fishing on weekends, help with my science projects, and never missed a school event. We would have daddy-daughter dates every month where we would try new restaurants or activities. He called me his little princess and made me feel like the most important person in his world alongside my mother. After Mom died, everything changed. Dad fell into a deep depression. He would come home from work and stare blankly at the television for hours. Sometimes I would find him crying in their bedroom holding one of Mom's sweaters. The light had gone out in our home, and I didn't know how to bring it back. At 12 years old, I stepped up. I taught myself to cook simple meals by watching YouTube tutorials. I figured out how to do laundry, clean the house, and even pay some bills online with Dad's supervision. I thought if I could just take care of the practical things, maybe Dad would have space to heal. I wanted so badly to help him find his way back to me. "Dad, I made spaghetti for dinner," I would say, hoping for a smile. "Thanks, Christina," he would reply, but the smile rarely came. He was physically present, but emotionally unreachable. For 3 years, we existed in this painful limbo. I became more of a caretaker than a daughter. My teenage years began with adult responsibilities and grief that no child should have to manage. But I did it because I loved him, and because I hoped that one day we would be okay again. When I was 15, Dad started to emerge from his grief. He began showering regularly again, talking more at dinner, and occasionally asking about my day at school. I was so relieved to see glimpses of my old dad returning. Then he mentioned he had met someone at work named Diane. "She's in accounting," he said one evening. "We've been having lunch together sometimes." I was surprised, but cautiously optimistic. Maybe having a friend would help Dad continue to heal. What I didn't expect was how quickly their relationship would progress. Dad brought Diane home for dinner just a month after mentioning her. She was tall, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive-looking handbag. She smiled warmly at me and brought a store-bought cheesecake for dessert. "Your father talks about you all the time," she said, touching my shoulder. "I've been so looking forward to meeting you, Christina." During that first dinner, Diane was nothing but charming. She asked about my interests, complimented the meal I had prepared, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. She even helped with the dishes afterward, something that impressed both Dad and me. A week later, Dad introduced me to Diane's daughter Megan. She was 13, 2 years younger than me, with the same blonde hair as her mother, but with a perpetual pout on her face. Unlike her mother, she barely acknowledged my existence. "Hi," was all she said before asking if we had any soda in the house. Over the next few months, Diane and Megan became fixtures in our lives. Diane continued to be warm and friendly toward me, often bringing little gifts or offering to take me shopping. Dad seemed happier than he had been in years, laughing at Diane's jokes and holding her hand across the dinner table. I was happy for him, though sometimes it felt like things were moving too quickly. Just 6 months after they began dating, Dad announced they were getting married. "Diane makes me happy, Christina," he said when I expressed concern about the rush. "I know it seems fast, but when you get to be my age, you realize life is short. Your mother would want me to be happy." I wasn't so sure what Mom would think, but I wanted Dad to be happy. So I pushed my reservations aside and tried to be supportive. The wedding was small but elegant, held in Diane's church, with mostly her friends in attendance. I stood next to Dad as his best person, forcing a smile for the photographs, while a strange heaviness settled in my stomach. The change in Diane was almost immediate. The day after they returned from their weekend honeymoon, I came home from school to find she had rearranged our living room. "Christina, sweetie, I hope you don't mind, but that old furniture arrangement was so outdated," she said, not really asking for my opinion. "And I've boxed up some of those family photos to make room for our new blended family pictures. They're in the attic if you want any of them." When I went to look, I found boxes containing nearly all the photos of my mother. It felt like Diane was trying to erase her existence from our home. When I mentioned this to Dad, he sighed. "Diane is trying to make this house her home too, Christina. We need to be understanding." That became a pattern. Diane would make changes to our home or family routines, and Dad would ask me to be understanding. Meanwhile, Megan quickly claimed the bigger spare bedroom that had been my mother's craft room, and Diane redecorated it with expensive new furniture. My own room remained unchanged, except for the removal of several photos of Mom that had been on my dresser, which I later found in one of the attic boxes. The family dynamic shifted dramatically. Dad and Diane would take Megan shopping for new clothes or to her soccer games, often not even inviting me along. When they did, I felt like an afterthought. At dinner, the conversation revolved around Megan's activities or Diane's work. When I tried to talk about school or my friends, Diane would politely listen for a moment before steering the conversation back to Megan. "That's nice, Christina, but did you hear about Megan's science project? She got the highest grade in her class?" Diane would say, effectively dismissing my achievements. Several times I tried to talk to Dad privately about how I was feeling excluded, but he seemed unable or unwilling to see it. "You're just not used to sharing me, Christina," he would say. "This is an adjustment for all of us. Give it time." But time only made things worse. By the time I graduated high school, I felt like a guest in my own home. I had earned a partial scholarship to the local state university and decided to continue living at home to save money. Diane made it clear that this was a concession on her part. "Most kids your age would be living in dorms," she remarked when I announced my scholarship. "But I suppose saving money is sensible." Throughout my college years, I worked part-time jobs to pay for my expenses and contribute to the household. I maintained excellent grades, made the dean's list every semester, and graduated with honors in business management. Throughout it all, Dad became increasingly distant, more Diane's husband than my father, and I became the family housekeeper more than a daughter. After graduating college with honors in business management, I faced the harsh reality of a job market that wasn't exactly welcoming to new graduates. Despite sending out dozens of applications each week for positions in my field, I only received a handful of interviews that led nowhere. To make ends meet and continue contributing to household expenses, I took a job at a local retail store while continuing my search for a career track position. Despite working 30 to 40 hours a week at just above minimum wage, Diane's comments about my freeloading became more frequent and cutting. "When I was your age, I had my own apartment and was completely independent," she would say over dinner, conveniently forgetting that housing costs had tripled since her day, while wages had stagnated. What made her comments particularly unfair was that I had essentially become the family's housekeeper. I cooked dinner 5 nights a week, did most of the laundry, kept the common areas clean, and even tended to the garden that Diane loved to show off to her friends. Yet she spoke about me as if I contributed nothing. "Christina, the bathroom needs cleaning," Diane would say on my day off, despite the fact that I had already worked a full shift and was studying for a professional certification that might help my job prospects. Meanwhile, Megan, who was now in college herself and also living at home, was never asked to contribute to housework. Her room could be a disaster area. Her dishes would pile up in the sink and her laundry would be left in the washer for days, but Diane never said a word about it. "Megan is focusing on her studies," Diane would explain when I pointed out the double standard. "Her psychology degree is very demanding." As if my business management degree and professional certification studies weren't equally demanding. The blatant favoritism was impossible to ignore. The incidents of Diane belittling me in front of my father became more frequent and more public. During a family dinner with Diane's sister and her husband, I mentioned an interview I had the following week with a marketing firm. "Oh, don't get your hopes up," Diane interjected before I could finish. "Christina has had so many interviews that go nowhere. I think employers can sense when someone doesn't have real-world experience or drive." I saw my father wince slightly, but as usual, his defense was weak at best. "Now, Diane, Christina is trying very hard. The job market is tough right now." "I know, James," she replied, patting his hand condescendingly. "But at some point, we need to acknowledge that some people just take longer to launch. Not everyone has Megan's ambition." The irony that Megan had never held a job in her life while I had been working since I was 16 was apparently lost on everyone but me. When it came to family finances, Diane maintained iron-fisted control, despite the fact that I contributed a significant portion of my paycheck to household expenses. I had no say in how the money was spent, and often found that my contributions mysteriously didn't seem to offset any actual household costs. "We're going to need extra this month, Christina," Diane would announce periodically. "The property taxes went up or the water heater needs repairs." I never saw any receipts or bills, and when I asked to see the household budget to better understand where my money was going, Diane acted deeply offended. "Are you suggesting I'm mismanaging our finances?" she asked icily. "James, can you believe this?" Dad, as usual, tried to placate both sides without actually resolving anything. "Christina's just trying to learn about budgeting Diane, and Diane's been managing our finances very well, Christina." The conversation would end there with my questions unanswered and my suspicions growing. As time went on, I began to realize that Diane had been telling my father lies about my behavior when he wasn't around. Once I overheard her telling him that I had been rude and disrespectful to her when she asked me to clean the kitchen, a conversation that had never happened. Another time she claimed I had come home drunk and made a mess in the bathroom, when in reality I had been at the library studying until closing and came home exhausted but completely sober. Each time I tried to correct these falsehoods, Dad seemed less and less willing to believe me. "Why would Diane lie about something like that?" he would ask, genuinely confused, but clearly taking his wife's side. "Maybe you just don't remember Christina. You have been working so hard lately." My attempts to rebuild my relationship with my father were constantly sabotaged. I would invite him to lunch on weekends, only to have Diane suddenly schedule a family obligation that required his presence. I would try to talk to him about memories of Mom, only to have Diane interrupt with household questions or comments about how we need to focus on the present, not dwell in the past. It was during a particularly bad week at work that I confided in my coworker Taylor about my home situation. We had become friends over several months of working the same shifts, and she noticed I seemed unusually down. "My God, Christina, that's not normal," she said after I described a recent incident where Diane had accidentally donated a box of my mother's keepsakes to Goodwill. "That's psychological abuse." I was taken aback by her characterization. "Isn't that a bit dramatic?" "She's just difficult to live with." Taylor shook her head emphatically. "No, this is a pattern of behavior designed to isolate you from your dad and make you feel unwelcome in your own home. You need to move out." The suggestion wasn't new. I had thought about moving out many times, but my retail salary barely covered my student loan payments, car insurance, and the household contribution Diane demanded. Saving for a security deposit and first month's rent seemed impossible. And despite everything I worried about my father, he might be failing me as a dad, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he needed me in some way, that without me there as a buffer, Diane would completely isolate him from his past life and the memory of my mother. "I can't afford it yet," I told Taylor, "and I'm not ready to completely give up on Dad." A week later, I came home early from work to find Diane in my room going through my desk drawers. She claimed she was looking for a stapler, but I had seen her reading through a notebook where I kept personal thoughts and financial notes. That night, I opened a new bank account at a different bank than the one our family used and arranged for a portion of my paycheck to be direct deposited there. It wasn't much, but it was something Diane couldn't access or monitor. Around this time, I also began interviewing more seriously for positions in my field. The job market had improved slightly, and my certification studies were progressing well. I had several promising leads, including a marketing assistant position at a local company that would nearly double my current salary. During a rare afternoon alone in the house, I ventured into the attic to retrieve some of the family photos Diane had banished. While there, I discovered boxes of my mother's things that I thought had been donated or thrown away years ago. Among them was a photo album I had never seen before, filled with pictures of my parents when they were young before I was born. They looked so happy and in love. I sat there for hours crying and connecting with memories of a woman who had been systematically erased from our family narrative. It strengthened my resolve to find a way out of this toxic situation, not just for myself, but to preserve her memory as well. In early June, I started noticing excited conversations between Dad, Diane, and Megan that would abruptly stop when I entered the room. At first, I thought they might be planning something for my upcoming birthday in July, though Diane had never made much of an effort for my birthdays before. Still, Dad had been a little warmer to me lately, so I allowed myself a small hope. That hope grew when I found glossy brochures for a luxury resort in Hawaii on the coffee table one afternoon. Hawaii had always been a dream destination for me. Mom and Dad had planned to take me there for my high school graduation, but after Mom died, the trip was forgotten. Seeing those brochures made me wonder if Dad had remembered that old promise. "Are we planning a trip?" I asked casually at dinner that evening. Dad glanced at Diane before answering vaguely, "Just looking at some options for later this summer." Megan, never one for subtlety, smiled smugly. "It's going to be amazing. I've always wanted to try surfing." I noticed she said "I" rather than "we," but tried not to read too much into it. Over the next couple of weeks, I heard more snippets about flight times, hotel reservations, and activities. Each time I tried to join these conversations, they would shift to more general topics, or Diane would find a household task that urgently needed my attention. Finally, 2 weeks before the apparent departure date, I cornered my father in his home office. "Dad, what's going on with this Hawaii trip? No one will give me a straight answer about dates or plans." He shuffled papers on his desk, avoiding eye contact. "Well, Christina, we were thinking of going the last 2 weeks of July." July was just days away, and this was the first concrete information I'd received. "That's in less than 2 weeks. I'll need to request time off work immediately. Why didn't anyone tell me sooner?" Dad looked uncomfortable. "Well, that's the thing. Diane thought, given your work situation, that you might not be able to get the time off." "I can try," I insisted. "My manager is pretty flexible if I give her enough notice." "The tickets are already booked," he said quietly, "and the resort only had a room with 3 beds available." I felt a cold realization wash over me. "You're not planning for me to come, are you?" Dad finally met my eyes, his expression a mixture of guilt and resignation. "Christina, you're 23 now, an adult. Diane thought this should be just for us and Megan, since she'll be going back to school in the fall. You understand, right?" I didn't understand, not at all, but years of conditioning had taught me to swallow my hurt rather than express it. "Right, of course, it's fine." It wasn't fine, but what could I say? That I was hurt to be excluded from a family vacation, that it felt like yet another way of telling me I wasn't really part of their family, that after years of being treated like the household help, this was the final confirmation of my status. The morning they were set to leave, I woke up to an unusually quiet house. Venturing downstairs, I found a note on the kitchen counter in my father's handwriting. "Christina, we decided to take an early flight to avoid traffic. There's money in the usual place for groceries. Back in 2 weeks. Dad. No, love you. No, will miss you." Not even a "sorry for leaving without saying goodbye." Just logistics and a reminder of my role as house sitter. I stood in the kitchen reading and rereading those 2 impersonal sentences, feeling a strange numbness spread through me. The house felt both empty and suffocating at the same time. I wandered from room to room, noticing all the family photos on the walls. Most featured Diane, Dad, and Megan. There were a few with me included, always positioned at the edges where I could be easily cropped out if desired. Mom's presence had been completely erased except for one small photo of my high school graduation, where Dad had his arm around me. That picture remained only because it was in my room. My phone rang around noon, Dad's number. "Hey, Dad," I answered, hoping for an apology, or at least an acknowledgement that leaving without saying goodbye was hurtful. Christina, we're at the resort. Just wanted to make sure everything's okay at the house. His voice sounded slightly tense. Everything's fine, I replied flatly. You could have woken me up to say goodbye. We were running late. He said, the excuse sounding hollow even to him, I suspected. Listen, can you make sure to water Diane's roses? She's worried about them in this heat. Of course. The roses. More important than his daughter's feelings. Why didn't you tell me I wasn't invited on this trip? I asked, suddenly the question bursting out before I could stop it. You let me believe for weeks that I might be included. There was silence, then muffled voices, as if Dad had covered the phone to speak to someone else. Then Diane's voice came on the line, sharp and annoyed. Christina, this trip has been planned for months as a special vacation for Megan before she returns to university. Not everything is about you. I never said it was about me, I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. I just would have appreciated honesty instead of being misled. Oh, please. Diane snapped, her facade of politeness dropping completely. You're nothing but a freeloader living in our house like you own the place. You should be grateful we let you stay at all. I heard Megan laughing in the background, and then my father's voice, faint but audible. Diane, that's a bit harsh. It's the truth, James, Diane retorted, not bothering to cover the phone. She's 23 years old and still living at home. My God, I was married with a child by her age. The humiliation burned through me, made worse by knowing that both my father and Megan were listening to this tirade without intervening. I ended the call without another word, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I sat at the kitchen table for what felt like hours, replaying the conversation, and all the years of similar moments that had led to this point. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. Diane's just stressed from travel. Don't take it personally. Don't take it personally. As if being called a freeloader in my own home, the home I helped maintain, the home that had once belonged to my mother too, wasn't deeply personal. I called Taylor, my voice breaking as I recounted what had happened. Within an hour, she was at my door with a bottle of wine and a sympathetic ear. You know this is completely messed up, right? She said as we sat on the couch. They're gaslighting you into thinking you're the problem when they're the toxic ones. I nodded, the truth of her words sinking in. I keep making excuses for Dad, thinking he'll eventually stand up to her, but he never does. I don't think he ever will. Then maybe it's time you stood up for yourself, Taylor suggested. You've got 2 weeks with the house to yourself. Use that time to figure out your next steps. As Taylor left that evening, she hugged me tightly. Remember, Christina, you deserve better than this, and you're stronger than you think. Her words echoed in my mind as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to really feel the anger that had been building beneath the surface. I was done being the family doormat. It was time to reclaim my life and my dignity. After Taylor left, I sat alone in the quiet house, truly allowing myself to feel the full weight of my emotions for the first time in years. The grief over my mother's death, which I'd never properly processed, while taking care of my father. The hurt of watching Dad build a new family, where I was clearly an afterthought. The anger at Diane's systematic campaign to diminish me and erase Mom's memory. The betrayal of being excluded from a family vacation, without even the courtesy of a direct conversation. I cried until I had no tears left, curled up in my childhood bed, clutching an old teddy bear my mother had given me. When the tears finally subsided, something had shifted inside me. The sadness remained, but it was now accompanied by a newfound clarity and resolve. The next morning, I walked through the house with fresh eyes, noticing things I'd become blind to over the years. The way family photos had been arranged to minimize my presence. How my mother's favorite reading chair had been relegated to the garage, while Diane's gaudy accent pieces took center stage. The fact that Megan's university pennants and sports trophies were prominently displayed, while my academic achievements were nowhere to be seen. I went into the family office, where Dad kept important documents, driven by a sudden need to connect with my mother through whatever traces of her remained in the house. In a filing cabinet rarely used since Diane took over the finances, I found folders of old bank statements, insurance documents, and property records from before Mom died. One manila envelope caught my attention. It was labeled Elizabeth's Will and Life Insurance. With shaking hands, I opened it and began reading through the legal documents inside. What I discovered made my blood run cold. According to the will, my mother had left her life insurance policy a substantial sum of $300,000 in trust for me, specifically for my education and first home purchase. The money was to be held by my father as trustee until I turned 18, at which point he was supposed to inform me of the inheritance and help me manage it wisely. I was 23 now. Not once had my father mentioned this inheritance. Not when I was applying for college and taking out student loans. Not when I graduated and struggled to find work. Not during any of the times Diane had called me a freeloader or suggested I should move out but couldn't afford to. Digging deeper into the files, I found statements showing that shortly after Dad married Diane, large withdrawals began from what appeared to be the trust account. $10,000 toward home renovations, $20,000 for family debt consolidation, $15,000 for a vehicle purchase that coincided with Megan getting a brand new car for her 16th birthday. By the time I found the most recent statement, less than $50,000 remained of my inheritance. The money my mother had set aside to secure my future had been systematically drained to fund my stepfamily's lifestyle. Tucked inside the folder was another envelope, this one addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. It was dated a month before she died and labeled, "For Christina's 18th birthday." With trembling fingers, I opened it and pulled out a letter I was never meant to read 5 years late. "My dearest Christina," it began. "If you're reading this, I've been gone for 6 years, and you've grown into a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. I wish more than anything that I could be there to see the remarkable person you've surely become." The letter continued with my mother's hopes for my future, her advice about education, relationships, and finding purpose. She mentioned the insurance money she'd left for me, explaining that she wanted me to use it to pursue my dreams without financial burden. The final paragraph broke me. "Remember that our home is as much yours as it was mine and your father's. It holds our family history and love within its walls. No matter what direction life takes you or your father after I'm gone, you always have a rightful place there. It is your sanctuary and birthright." I sat on the office floor, letter clutched to my chest, as another shocking realization dawned on me. Our family home, the house I'd been made to feel like a guest in. The house Diane had systematically transformed to erase any trace of my mother. I frantically searched through more files until I found what I was looking for, the original property deed from when my parents purchased the house. There it was in black and white: James and Elizabeth Walker, joint tenants with right of survivorship. The house had been bought by both my parents. When Mom died, her share should have passed to Dad. But legally, I now wondered if that had actually happened properly. Given what I discovered about my inheritance, I had reason to doubt that all legal requirements had been followed. I took photos of everything with my phone, then carefully returned the documents to their folders, my mind racing. I needed expert advice. This wasn't just about feeling excluded anymore. This was about potential financial misconduct involving my inheritance. Taylor's cousin Alicia worked as a legal assistant at a law firm specializing in estate matters. After swearing Taylor to secrecy, I asked if she could arrange an informal conversation with Alicia to get some preliminary guidance. 2 days later, over coffee at a cafe far from my neighborhood, Alicia listened carefully as I explained what I'd found. "Based on what you're describing," she said when I finished, "there could be some serious issues with how your father managed your trust. Trustees have a fiduciary duty to act in the beneficiary's best interest, not their own or their new family's." "What about the house?" I asked. "Do I have any rights there?" Alicia frowned thoughtfully. "That's more complicated. If the property transferred properly through right of survivorship, it would legally be your father's alone now. However," she added, seeing my disappointment, "if there were any irregularities in how your mother's estate was handled, it could open up questions about all assets, including the house." "What should I do?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the legal complexities. "You need to consult with an actual attorney," Alicia advised. "This is beyond informal advice. I can recommend someone at our firm who offers free initial consultations. And Christina," she added, her expression serious, "gather as much documentation as you can while you have access to it." That night I lay awake considering my options. The practical part of me knew pursuing legal action would permanently damage my relationship with my father. But another voice, one that sounded remarkably like my mother's, whispered that I deserved justice and the future she had tried to secure for me. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed my hurt for the sake of keeping peace, all the moments I'd made myself smaller to accommodate Diane's ego, all the years I'd worked and contributed while being treated like a burden. The next morning, I called the attorney Alicia recommended and scheduled a consultation for the following day. Then I went back to the office and carefully photographed every relevant document I could find. I discovered even more evidence of financial mismanagement, including emails between Diane and Dad discussing using Christina's college fund for a kitchen renovation. As I closed the last file drawer, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time in years, I was taking control of my situation instead of just enduring it. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be a passive victim anymore. I looked around at the house that should have been partly my sanctuary, as my mother intended. Instead of feeling the usual pain and resentment, I felt a new emotion taking root: determination. Attorney Sarah Wilson's office was located in a modest building downtown. Nothing like the imposing glass towers I'd imagined housing legal professionals. Sarah herself defied my expectations as well. Instead of a stern, intimidating figure in a power suit, she was a warm woman in her 50s, with a practical bob and reading glasses that hung on a beaded chain around her neck. "Christina, thank you for bringing such thorough documentation," she said after I'd walked her through everything I'd discovered. "It gives us a clear starting point for understanding what's happened with your mother's estate." She spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the materials, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and conversations. I watched her expression grow increasingly concerned as she pieced together the timeline. "Based on what I'm seeing," she finally said, setting down her pen, "there appear to be several serious issues with how your inheritance was handled. The trust your mother established had very specific instructions that don't appear to have been followed." "What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked. "It means you likely have grounds for legal action to recover misappropriated funds and possibly more," Sarah explained. "The statute of limitations for breach of fiduciary duty in this state is 5 years from discovery of the breach. Since you only discovered this now, the clock just started ticking." "And what about the house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do I have any claim there?" Sarah tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. "That's more complicated. Your mother's will should have specified what happened to her share of the house. From what you've shown me, it appears your father may have conducted an improper transfer of the property after her death, possibly to facilitate refinancing when he married Diane. So I might have a claim to part of the house." The possibility made my heart race. "Potentially. We'd need to investigate further, but there's enough here to proceed if you want to." The question hung in the air between us. Did I want to proceed? Taking legal action against my own father was a momentous decision, one that would permanently alter our relationship. But then I thought of my mother's letter, her wishes for my future that had been deliberately kept from me, and my resolve strengthened. "What would the process look like?" I asked. Sarah outlined a step-by-step approach. First, a formal review of all documentation, then filing initial legal papers to establish my claim. This would be followed by discovery, where we could request additional documentation from my father and financial institutions. Throughout, there would be opportunities for negotiation and settlement before proceeding to a full court case. How much will this cost? I asked the practical question, bringing me back to reality. My secret savings account held only about $3,000, hardly enough for extended legal proceedings. "Given the circumstances and the clear evidence of misconduct," Sarah said, "I'm willing to take this case on contingency. That means I'd receive a percentage of any funds recovered, rather than charging hourly fees up front." Her offer nearly brought me to tears. Someone believed my case had enough merit to invest their professional time in it. "How soon can we start?" I asked. "We can file the initial papers this week," Sarah replied. "But Christina, I need to ask, are you prepared for your father's reaction? Once legal documents are served, there's no going back." I thought about my father's face when he realized what I had discovered and what I was doing. Would there be shame? Anger? Would he try to blame it all on Diane? Would he finally stand up for me and acknowledge how wrong things had been? I'm ready, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. They're away for another 10 days. I want everything filed and ready before they return. Over the next week, I worked closely with Sarah to prepare the legal documents. The official complaint outlined how my father had breached his fiduciary duty as trustee of my inheritance, improperly used funds meant for my education and future, and potentially mishandled the transfer of property after my mother's death. While Sarah worked on the legal front, I began methodically preparing for the fallout. I accepted the marketing assistant position. I'd been interviewing for securing a steady income that would allow me to support myself. Taylor offered her spare bedroom as temporary housing when the inevitable confrontation happened. I packed my most important possessions, particularly items with sentimental value connected to my mother, and moved them to a small storage unit I rented. I couldn't bear the thought of those treasures being used as leverage, or worse, accidentally discarded in retaliation. During my search for important documents, I discovered even more evidence of financial impropriety. Bank statements showing large transfers from my trust to the joint account Dad shared with Diane. Credit card statements showing Megan's shopping sprees classified as educational expenses. A home equity line of credit that had been taken out against the house using equity that should have partially belonged to me if my mother's ownership had been properly accounted for. Each discovery strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about me feeling excluded from a family vacation. This was about years of systematic financial exploitation hidden behind familial obligation and guilt. The day before the family was due to return, I received a call from Sarah. "Everything's filed, Christina. The court has accepted our petition and your father will be served with the documents tomorrow afternoon." I had arranged to be working during their expected return time, wanting to avoid the initial confrontation until they'd had time to process the legal documents. Sarah had advised me to maintain as much distance as possible in these early stages to prevent the situation from escalating emotionally. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, looking at the walls that had witnessed my growth, my grief, and now my stand for justice. A strange calm had settled over me. Whatever happened next, I had taken control of my story. I was no longer waiting for my father to notice my pain or for Diane to accept me. I was acting in my own best interest, just as they had been doing all along. I placed my mother's letter on my desk, her words of love and empowerment the last thing I read before turning out the light. "You always have a rightful place here. It is your sanctuary and birthright." For the first time in years, I felt like my mother was with me, guiding me toward the future she had wanted for me. A future where I was valued, respected, and free from the shadow of those who had tried to diminish me. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and pain, but tonight, I slept soundly, wrapped in the certainty that I was finally honoring both my mother's wishes and my own worth. The confrontation unfolded almost exactly as I had imagined it would. I returned from work to find my father pacing the living room, legal papers clutched in his hand, his face ashen. Diane sat rigidly on the couch, her expression a mixture of fury and calculation. Megan hovered uncertainly in the doorway for once, looking less smug and more confused. "What is this?" Dad demanded as soon as I walked through the door, waving the papers at me. "A lawsuit against your own father. Have you lost your mind?" I set down my purse with deliberate calm. "It's exactly what it appears to be. A legal claim to recover the inheritance Mom left for me that was misused." "Misused?" Diane interjected, her voice shrill. "We gave you a home. We supported you through college. No," I cut her off firmly. "You didn't support me through college. I worked part-time jobs, took out student loans, and contributed to household expenses. All while the money my mother specifically left for my education was being used for kitchen renovations and Megan's new car." Dad's face flushed. "Christina, there were family expenses that needed to be covered. Your mother would have understood that the money needed to benefit the whole family." "That's not what her will specified," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "And that's not what you told me when I turned 18 because you never told me about the inheritance at all. I had to find out on my own 5 years later by accident. We were going to tell you, he protested weakly. When after it was all gone, after I'd struggled for years believing I had no options except to endure being treated like an unwelcome guest in what should have been my home, too. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photo of Mom's letter to me. She wanted me to have this on my 18th birthday. You kept it from me, just like you kept the truth about the house from me. His eyes widened at the mention of the house. What about the house? Mom was co-owner. When she died, there should have been proper legal procedures followed regarding her share. Instead, you refinanced after marrying Diane without addressing my potential interest. My attorney believes there may have been improper property transfers. Your attorney is fishing for a payday, Diane snapped, standing up. This house belongs to your father and me now. Your mother has been gone for over a decade. You can't just show up with wild claims after all this time. They're not wild claims, I replied calmly. They're documented legal and financial irregularities, and I didn't just show up with them. I've been here all along being systematically erased and exploited while you turned my father against me. That's ridiculous. Diane's voice rose. James, are you going to let her talk to me like this in my own home? Dad looked torn, his eyes moving between the legal papers, Diane's angry face, and me. For perhaps the first time since Mom died, he was really seeing me, really hearing me. Christina, he said, his voice softer now. I never meant to hurt you. After your mother died, managing her estate was complicated. I was grieving, trying to keep our lives together. And then you met Diane. I finished for him. And suddenly Mom's plans for me, her wishes for my future, didn't matter anymore. That's not true, he protested, but his eyes didn't meet mine. Isn't it? You used my inheritance to fund your new family. You let Diane redecorate the house and pack away all traces of Mom. You stood by while she treated me like an unwelcome house guest. And then you excluded me from a family vacation without even having the courage to tell me directly. The vacation was Diane's idea, Dad admitted quietly. Of course it was my idea, Diane interjected. We needed family time without the constant cloud of your first wife hanging over everything. Christina is an adult now, not a child who needs to be included in every family activity. I'm standing right here, I said coldly. And I've never been included in any family activity since you married my father. I've been tolerated at best, deliberately excluded at worst. Dad sank into a chair, looking suddenly older and very tired. I had no idea you felt this way. How could you not know? I asked, genuine bewilderment in my voice. I tried to talk to you so many times over the years. You always dismissed my concerns or made excuses for Diane's behavior. He dismissed you because you were being ridiculous and entitled, Diane cut in. Always wanting special treatment because you were here first, always playing the victim. I never wanted special treatment, I replied evenly. I wanted equal treatment. I wanted to be treated like a daughter, not an inconvenience. I wanted my father to honor my mother's memory and wishes instead of letting you erase her from our lives. You ungrateful little... Diane began, but Dad raised his hand to stop her. Diane, please, he said wearily. Let me talk to my daughter. Your daughter is suing you, she practically shrieked. She's trying to take our house. I'm not trying to take anything that isn't legally mine, I corrected her. I'm trying to recover what was meant for me and improperly used. Megan, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. Wait, are you saying my car was bought with your money? I turned to her, seeing not the smug stepsister of recent years, but the confused young woman she actually was. Yes, Megan. The car Dad and Diane bought for your 16th birthday was purchased with $15,000 from the trust my mother established for my education and future. Her face fell. I didn't know. None of this is Megan's fault, I acknowledged, turning back to my father and Diane. She was a child when you married. She only acted the way you taught her to act, believing what you taught her to believe. The truth of my words seemed to hit both Dad and Diane differently. Dad looked increasingly ashamed, while Diane's anger only seemed to intensify. This is absurd, she declared. James, call our lawyer immediately. We're not going to be extorted by your daughter's ridiculous claims. They're not ridiculous claims, I said quietly. "They're well-documented legal issues that any family court will recognize. My attorney is confident we have a strong case." I moved toward the stairs, intending to go to my room, but paused to address my father once more. "I'm moving out tomorrow. I've accepted a job in marketing that starts next week. I've arranged temporary housing until this is resolved." "Christina, wait," Dad said, standing quickly. "We can talk about this. We can work something out without lawyers and courts." "We're well past that point," I replied, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and resolution. "I tried for years to talk to you, Dad. You weren't willing to listen. Now you'll have to listen to my attorney instead." As I climbed the stairs to pack the last of my belongings, I heard Diane and my father arguing in hushed but intense voices. I closed my bedroom door, blocking out their words, but not the reality of what had just happened. I had finally stood up for myself, spoken my truth, and refused to accept less than what I deserved. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, it was a road I had chosen for myself. The months that followed my confrontation with Dad and Diane were some of the most challenging and transformative of my life. I moved into Taylor's spare bedroom temporarily, while the legal proceedings unfolded, throwing myself into my new marketing job and trying to build a life independent of the family dynamics that had defined me for so long. The court case progressed more quickly than I had anticipated. Sarah, my attorney, had built such a strong case with the documentation I had provided that the judge fast-tracked our proceedings. Within 2 months, we received a ruling that sent shockwaves through what remained of my family. The court determined that my father had indeed breached his fiduciary duty as trustee of my inheritance. He was ordered to provide a full accounting of all funds from my mother's insurance policy with interest and to restore the misappropriated amount to a new trust under my sole control. Additionally, and perhaps most surprisingly, the judge found irregularities in how the house had been handled after my mother's death. "The property deed was never properly transferred," Sarah explained after the ruling. "Your mother's half interest should have gone through probate, but your father refinanced the home without completing that process. The court has determined that you have a legitimate claim to half ownership of the house." The final judgment was clear. The house would need to be sold and the proceeds divided equally between my father and me, after accounting for the value of improvements made since my mother's death. Alternatively, if my father wished to keep the house, he would need to buy out my interest at fair market value. When the judgment was delivered, I watched Diane's face crumple in disbelief. This was never the outcome she had anticipated when she married my father, and systematically worked to edge me out of my own home. Dad looked resigned, but also unexpectedly relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The house went on the market the following month. Diane had wanted to fight the ruling, but their lawyer advised against it, explaining that appeals would be costly and unlikely to succeed given the clear documentation of impropriety. As we worked with realtors to prepare the house for showing, I found myself sorting through the physical remnants of my childhood, deciding what to keep and what to let go. In the attic, I discovered more boxes of my mother's belongings that Diane had hidden away. Photo albums, jewelry books with my mother's notes in the margins. Each item was like reconnecting with a piece of her I had been denied for years. I also found letters she had written to my father during their courtship, full of love and hope for their future together. Reading them, I wondered how he could have so completely set aside that love in favor of Diane's manipulative affection. The house sold surprisingly quickly to a young family with 2 small children. Watching them tour the house, the children racing up and down the stairs with excitement, I felt a bittersweet sense of closure. This house that had become a battleground would now be a home again, filled with new memories for a family hopefully built on more honest foundations than mine had been. My share of the proceeds combined with the restored inheritance gave me enough money to make a down payment on a small house of my own, in a quiet neighborhood not far from my new job. It was nothing like the grand house I had grown up in, but it was mine entirely, a sanctuary, where no one could make me feel unwelcome or less than. The day I closed on my new home, I received an unexpected text from Megan, asking if we could meet for coffee. Curious and cautious, I agreed. "I want to apologize," she said as soon as we sat down, her eyes downcast. "I had no idea what was really going on all these years. Mom always told me you had your own inheritance, and didn't need anything from us. I don't blame you, Megan, I replied honestly. You were a child when our parents married. You believed what they told you. Still, I should have questioned things more as I got older, she admitted. The way Mom treated you never felt right, but I went along with it because it was easier. Our conversation continued for over an hour, both of us sharing our perspectives on the years we had lived together as reluctant stepsisters. By the end, while we weren't suddenly best friends, we had reached a new understanding based on honesty, rather than the manipulated narrative Diane had created. Dad and Mom are getting divorced, Megan revealed as we prepared to leave. He finally saw how she's been manipulating everyone for years. He wants to talk to you, but he's afraid you'll never forgive him. I took a deep breath, considering her words. I'm not sure what forgiveness looks like in this situation, Megan. He failed me as a father for a very long time. I know, she acknowledged, but he's really trying to understand where he went wrong. The lawsuit was like a wake-up call for him. A week later, I agreed to meet my father at a neutral location, a park where my mother and I used to feed ducks when I was little. He looked older than his years, the stress of recent months evident in the new lines around his eyes. I don't know where to begin, Christina, he said after an awkward greeting. I failed you in so many ways. Yes, you did. I agreed not to be cruel, but because honesty was the only foundation upon which we might build something new. After your mother died, I was lost, he continued. When I met Diane, she made me feel like I could have a normal life again. I was so grateful for that feeling that I ignored the warning signs. I let her come between us because it was easier than standing up to her. That doesn't excuse using my inheritance without telling me, I pointed out, or hiding Mom's letter to me, or treating me like an unwelcome guest in my own home for years. No, it doesn't, he admitted. Nothing excuses those things. I can only say that I got so caught up in trying to please Diane and build this new family that I lost sight of my most important responsibility, being your father. We talked for nearly 3 hours, covering years of hurt misunderstandings and betrayals. There were tears on both sides, moments of anger and pain, but also glimpses of the connection we had once shared before my mother's death, and Diane's arrival had fractured our relationship. By the end of our conversation, nothing was resolved entirely, but a door had been opened. We agreed to try meeting once a month to see if we could rebuild some kind of relationship based on honesty and respect, rather than obligation and guilt. 3 months later, Dad came to my housewarming party. He brought a small wooden box I had never seen before. This was your mother's jewelry box, he explained, handing it to me. Diane insisted we store it away because it upset her to see it. I should have given it to you years ago. Inside were my mother's favorite pieces, including her wedding ring and a locket that contained a tiny photo of the three of us when I was a baby. Holding these treasures that should have been mine all along, I felt my mother's presence more strongly than I had in years. Thank you, I said simply, recognizing the gesture for what it was, a small step toward making amends. Dad found an apartment after the divorce was finalized. It was nothing fancy, but he seemed more at peace there than he had in the grand house Diane had insisted on maintaining. We continued our monthly meetings, sometimes just for coffee, other times for longer talks about our shared past and separate futures. Diane, I heard from Megan, had moved to Florida to be near her sister. She continued to believe she had done nothing wrong, that I had manipulated the situation and turned my father against her. Her narrative hadn't changed, but it no longer had the power to affect my life. As I settled into my new home and career, I began to heal from years of emotional abuse and neglect. I decorated my house with photos of my mother and mementos of our time together. I planted a garden in the backyard, remembering how she and I used to tend flowers together when I was small. I invited friends over for dinner parties where everyone was valued and welcomed equally. On what would have been my mother's 60th birthday, I sat in my garden looking up at the stars, feeling her presence in a way I hadn't allowed myself to for many years. I made it, Mom, I whispered. Not exactly the way you planned, but I'm okay. I have a home of my own. I'm building a life I can be proud of. And I never forgot your love, even when others tried to erase it. The journey from doormat to homeowner had been painful but necessary. By standing up for myself and what was rightfully mine, I had reclaimed not just my inheritance, but my dignity and self-worth. The house my mother had helped purchase had eventually led me to a true home of my own, one where I was never made to feel like a freeloader or an unwelcome guest. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who treated you unfairly? How did you find the courage to advocate for yourself? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Remember that sometimes the hardest battles we fight are within our own families, but standing up for yourself is always worth it in the end. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I hope it helps anyone facing similar challenges to find their own path to healing and independence.